Thank you very much for inviting me into this discussion. I was really thrilled by Davide's invitation, and I wanted to respond to it, although I know that the scientific traditions in art history are not directly the subject of my research, and I am not really an expert on them. I would like to take a few well-known examples from the art history and ask how artistic skills have been used as tools for research and what kind of epistemic assumptions may have been involved there. But my aim here is mainly to feed the discussion by surveying the background of the subject of today's discussion. I'm probably not able to provide any new information for you or any new research outcomes, but I rather hope that my presentation might trigger some questions and ideas and viewpoints for the shared brainstorming. And now I try to share my PowerPoint. Let's see how that happens. Yes, it succeeded. So I'm also a bit afraid that I cannot offer much help for the legitimization of artistic research, because I thought it's a bit slippery slope if we justify something by just saying that it has a long tradition or somehow a timeless origin, which proves its validity because it has been done before. So instead of trying to find a direct continuity from the historical examples to contemporary artistic research, I would rather like to ask how they have differed from or resembled of each other. Perhaps I would even emphasize the differences more, because we cannot simply apply our contemporary terminology to the past. For example, the Renaissance artists, which were mentioned by Anke Harman, they would have understood the concepts of art and research very differently from us. Activities like painting, literature, theater, or music, yes, they flourished during the Renaissance, but they were not grouped together under the umbrella term of art as they are today. And what we call natural sciences like physics or biology, they were studied by philosophies. And this is not only a matter of wording. It's the way in which we categorize things is an inherent part of the cultural worldview that constitutes the horizon of our thinking, as for example, Michel Foucault has claimed in his writings. And in other words, we can never fully access the past ways of thinking, and we can never perceive the world or ourselves in the same ways as the Renaissance artists did. Therefore, we cannot make any strong claims, but only reflect on what is known about them. And we must remember the uncertainty of this. But yet, I think that exactly these Renaissance artists are a very good example for the discussion, partly because they were living during a period when the entire Western worldview was in a turbulence. Philosophers or scientists and artists from different branches were posing fundamental epistemological, ontological, and ethical questions about the position of human being in the universe, as we are doing also today. And when we talk about the Renaissance artists, the best known example is, of course, Leonardo da Vinci, who, besides his famous paintings, made an enormous contribution to science through the illustrations he drew about human anatomy and through the machines he invented. It has been said that in Leonardo's work, scientific and artistic activities were so integrated to each other that there was no clear boundary between them. For him and his contemporaries, science, scientia, meant actually theory, which was the opposite of practice. But there was no practice without theory. And Leonardo thought that art was a form of creative knowledge which went beyond science because it could express also human feelings. But in modern terms, Leonardo's worldview was actually very scientific. In his writings, he believed that the order of the universe was based on mathematics and the perceivable material world was following the same principles. The mathematical laws manifested, for example, in the proportions of the human body, which reflected the macroscopic structure of the whole universe, like they were the microscopic world that had the same rules as the macrocosmos. So Leonardo shared the common belief of the time that the universe was like a huge clockwork which was put in motion by a superior intelligence, the god or some other spiritual force. However, he was not interested in spiritual questions, but in tangible natural phenomena, because he thought that the infinite reasons of the universe could be understood through experience, and the facts had to be tested through empirical evidence. In other words, Leonardo thought that the empirical observation and theoretical reasoning had to match with each other in order to be correct. And that legitimized also the scientific validity of art for him, I think, because art should imitate nature, because it would thus also repeat the mathematical principles that were ruling the world. And therefore, imitation was creative because it required fundamental ontological understanding of the nature. It was the deepest way of understanding the world. But on the other hand, I think we must remember that at this time, drawing or painting were the only ways of making any visual notes from anything. So art was linked to science also for very practical reasons, because it could provide information that could not be recorded by writing. And this was also expressed by Leonardo. And for example, this drawing by Albrecht Dürer, who was 20 years younger than Leonardo, this drawing can be seen as a botanical study as well as a beautiful artwork. But on the other hand, the drawing techniques were mastered by scientific tools like geometric perspective, which made them more exact and objective, because these perspective machines separated the vision from the bodily observer. In other words, the vision became universalized, independent of changing individuals and their circumstances. In this way, the visual arts and empirical sciences have been closely linked to each other since the Renaissance. And in the 19th century, the famous English landscape painter, John Constable, argued in his lecture that painting was a science that examined the laws of nature, and that landscapes could be considered as a branch of natural philosophy, and pictures could be seen as experiments. However, I think that the relation between art and science would be very different if we looked at music, literature, or dance, for example. And I'm actually really curious to hear about what Alex has to say about music, as I learned that he is an expert on that. Because the visual arts have had a specific epistemic role, probably because vision has been considered the primary human sense through which we can get the most exact information from the surroundings. And visual illustrations still have a very important function in scientific research, although the technologies have changed a lot. But on the other hand, these technologically produced scientific images can also be seen as aesthetic experiences, like this telescope picture of a nebula, which is sold also as a poster. However, this position of vision as the most important and reliable sense has never been unproblematic, because it has always been known that our eyes can easily deceive us. And this double character of vision as the source of both knowledge and illusions can be taken as an analogy of the more general fundamental philosophical problems about the ways in which human beings can be in touch with the surrounding world. Art historian Martin Jay has written an interesting, although already a quite old book, where he claims that there have traditionally been two simultaneous ways of understanding the epistemology of vision. So it's either the sense perception of the two physical eyes of the world, or it has been like a mental inner vision, what is seen by the eyes of the mind that can somehow see beyond the visible surface. And moreover, the physical sense perception has been seen both as a direct access to the world as it is, or as a more complex processing between mental faculties and pure data. And the inner vision could represent either eternal ideas and reason that manifested in pure geometric forms, or instinctive emotions and otherworldly experiences that were hazy and obscure. So according to Jay, whatever your philosophical standpoint was, you could always use visual perception as a perfect metaphor for accessing truthful knowledge. And what he calls a denigration of vision started first in the 20th century French philosophy, which somehow tried to overcome this dichotomy between empiricism and rationalism, which is behind this, also these roles of the vision. This French philosophy tried to examine the primary encountering between inner mind and outer world as the basis of both experience and conceptualization. So I'll return to that later, but before that, I'll take a short look at the early modernist art movements at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, which was another period when the worldview was shaken because of the rapid development of science and technologies. And during that time, it was fairly commonly even believed that future scientists would be able to solve all problems and reveal all secrets of life, although there were critical voices too. But many artists were really fascinated by the new possibilities of science and believed that art should follow similar paths. And this similarity between artists and scientists reached its peak in the naturalism of the late 19th century, mainly among writers and playwrights like Emile Zola, August Strindberg, or Henrik Ibsen. They drew inspiration from the contemporary scientific theories and inventions, especially from Darwin's evolution theory, the experimental medicine developed by Claude Bernard, and the scientific positivism developed by Hippolyte Taine in social sciences. Shortly put, the naturalists suggested that the author should work like a pathologist who was looking for the causes of an illness. Like an empiricist and experimental scientist, they should put together all facts and observe how the story unfolds. They had a strong deterministic belief that once you knew all the key information about the events, you should be able to deduce the inevitable outcomes. And the reader or spectator was put in front of a riddle. So by looking at the evidence given by the author, they should be able to understand why the story unfolds the way it does. And the answer was to be found in reasons like the genetic inheritance, social circumstances, or psychological mechanisms. There was, however, a huge problem with the naturalistic project. How could the author collect all the facts, and how could they be objective? In other words, how could they leave their bodily and mental limitations behind? August Strindberg, one of the early naturalists who later turned to expressionism and symbolism, is best known as a writer, but he was also a painter, photographer, and an amateur scientist. He was almost obsessed with the idea of documenting the world as it is, which sometimes led to very bizarre experiments when he tried to capture the true essence of things. So Strindberg exposed photographic plates to the night sky and believed that he could thus capture cosmic radiation and take truthful pictures of the stars. He even sent the results to the Astronomical Society in Paris, but they did not take him seriously. And Strindberg took similar photos of crystallization processes and realized that they resembled of growing plants. He thus believed that he had proved that there was no boundary between organic and non-organic matter. But before we start laughing at Strindberg, I think we must remember that phenomena like X-rays or radioactivity had just recently been invented by scientists, and they somehow shook the world. There was something that nobody could have imagined. So Strindberg and many other artists consequently asked, why couldn't there be also other ways of revealing the deepest mysteries of life, for example, by means of art? And in those days, spiritualism became very popular among artists. And a very good example of them was Hilma af Klint, who has become famous only recently, but she was in fact one of the pioneering abstract painters. And she used automatic drawing and writing in her work, among other things. And she believed that she could serve as a medium between the spiritual and mundane worlds. According to the symbolist and romanticist tradition, to which af Klint belonged, spiritual and material phenomena could be connected by art, which could reveal some deeper truths beyond the visible surface. But while these naturalism, symbolism, and expressionism have usually been seen as opposite movements, I think they were also intrinsically linked together. In fact, it was not rare that the same artists were periodically interested in all of them, like Strindberg. And it has been said that when you try really hard to observe something through your perception, you end up observing your own processes of perceiving and conceptualization. And there, you always end up in a mystery because you can never yourself access your own being as it is. So both naturalistic and symbolist artists describe their activity as research. But actually, I think that they had a different approach than contemporary artist researchers. To me, they basically seem to think that the artwork could provide some superior truth through its forms and expressions that could be decoded by the spectator. And this would mean that the knowledge would somehow be permanently embedded in the artwork, and it would be separate from both its maker, who serves as a medium for its message, and also for its receiver, who should be able to read the message of the artwork. And as far as I have understood, in contemporary artist research, we are rather stressing the lived, embodied, and temporal processes of making and receiving art. And this makes the artistic knowledge unstable because it emerges only from events, actions, and experiences, which never stay the same. The knowledge is then understood as embodied and situational because it's always tied to the knowing person and their position in the world. At least this is how I understand the term of not knowing, that we are not chasing after final truths, but we are living in a never-ending process of researching, which does not give any final answers. Instead, we are facing our own incapability of ever knowing anything for sure. And I think this epistemic turn also means that the artistic knowledge is located more in the individual bodies than in the vision of the vision of the world, which can be somehow externalized. And here we come back to Jay's suggestion about the denigration of a vision. In contemporary artistic research, which very much builds on the French philosophy, the knowledge is not something that is situated in the world outside of ourselves so that we could just capture it by looking. It's understood as a process inside us when we encounter the outside world. And it's a process which we are living through in artistic events. However, I think that this is not a recent invention either, but I think it was already present at least in the historical avant-garde of the early 20th century. And I would end my survey with Oskar Schlemmer, who was both a painter and a dancer in the 1920s and 30s in the Weimar Republic, and he led the experimental theater workshop at the Bauhaus School in the 20s. And he actually, among other things, he developed a theory where he combined the geometric principles of space to the dynamic principles of a moving and experiencing human body through dance. Und der Tänzermensch, the human being as dancer who inhabits the space, could, according to Schlemmer, mediate between the phenomenal and the objective worlds. Melissa Trimmingham has analyzed Schlemmer's thinking as a bridging between rational spatial design and the embodied human feelings in space. Instead of a Gesamtkunstwerk that could integrate everything into one holistic performance, he rather sought for a dynamic synthesis between visual and bodily experiences. Trimmingham concludes that Schlemmer preceded postmodern theater, but I think that he also preceded artistic research with his experiments, and so did many of his contemporaries before us. But this was, again, not the same as today's artistic research. And what I'm trying to say here is that in our European tradition, art and science have traditionally been linked together somehow, at least visual arts and science have been linked together at least since Renaissance. And I think this linkage has never broken. But the character of this relation has depended on the historical, social, and cultural conditions and the mainstream philosophical ideas, and it has changed a lot. And I think we could learn very much by studying these different ancient forms of of art and science, because they can show how our contemporary notions are on the one hand constituted by the past, but on the other hand, they are also breaking up with the earlier traditions. And that also means that our ideas are very likely to change in the future too. So thank you for listening. I hope you have made some sense of this.